Thanks so much for joining us, Jen. Tell us a bit about yourself and what you're passionate about that led to your current role as Mayor of the City of Greater Bendigo.
So a bit about me. I became from Melbourne back in 1982 into Bendigo, so local now, 38 years. But I started off my career as a research scientist in microbiology, and so I've always been interested in health. And I suppose how I would frame how my career has evolved was that I moved from looking at the minutiae and the smallest to then moving to the bigger picture. I became interested in nutrition and herbal medicine and more preventative health approaches, and then moved on from there over the years after having a consultancy in Bendigo for many years. Interested in women's health as well. Did further study, and I wrote a book on disordered eating, and then decided to more formally go into the management side of things. So I ended up becoming the executive officer at Women's Health Rod and Mallee for a few years. And then I suppose it was after the children had left home, I thought, well, I can actually make a transition to doing some other things I'm interested in, like policy. So I went down to Melbourne and worked at Vic Health for a couple of years as a senior policy advisor. And then a job came up in Melbourne at an organisation called Cultivating Community as the CEO. And that was an urban agriculture organisation. So managing community gardens on public housing estates. So a couple dozen of those, and school programs and food programs. And it gave me a huge enthusiasm for the importance of working with community and what we can do with our food system to create change. So after I'd done that for a few years, I decided to work back in Bendigo consulting and set up my business thinking around the concept of growing change, and the food side of things has been quite a focus, but also climate change. And I'll come back to that later. So multiple angles of working with community, and then over the years being active in Bendigo with lots of different groups, I thought, well, maybe the next step would be to look at local government and that opportunity at a certain stage of life to be able to give back a bit to the community. And so I was fortunate to be elected to City of Greater Bendigo for the Lockwood Ward in 2016 and then re-elected last year.
So yeah, tonight we've got a bit of a theme, fostering and advocating for local-led solutions, and I'm particularly interested to chat around the climate change and food security and community resilience stuff that you're involved in. But first, what's your take on what local or community-led solutions are and the importance of them?
There's so many groups doing different things, with passions and interests, and when you get together with other people in groups, or groups communicating with other groups who are trying to achieve the same outcomes, that's really powerful. And you'll probably remember back, well, I think it was around 2008 or so, when Paul Hawken first came to Bendigo, and at that time he'd written a book called Blessed Unrest, and it was around what he called the largest social movement in the world, and documenting hundreds of thousands of groups that were establishing to do things which might have had an environmental or a social or an equity output, or things would have an impact on our world. And I think that we've got a unique point in history where we are at a very fortunate time to be able to have some pretty profound impacts on how our world is transitioning at the moment from a number of perspectives. And if we can work with people and learn a lot more about how to advocate and when and where, and that's where groups like yours and your work to assist people in making change is really important, because sometimes it gets a bit overwhelming with, we need to change policy, but look, the government's not doing it, and what can we do? We certainly need policy settings, but sometimes people will bypass that, and it's the community impacts and the community actions that drive change from the bottom up. So, people say we might be having a generational change. They're all part of local communities and communities of interest.
Yeah, so you've definitely mentioned some great examples there. And I've actually quite admired the role that you've played in some specific really great examples in Bendigo and community-led solutions in bringing partnerships and collaboration together. Have you got any that you could tell us a bit about, one or two that are standouts, the things that you've helped drive?
I suppose there's been some long-standing involvements of different groups, and over the years, the thing that I like to say is who's not here and why not, when we're going to set up programs and that. But when you look at policies, and food was a really good example, who are the decision makers? Who's at the table making decisions? Who sets the agenda? Who's pushing or delaying things? Delaying projects can stop progress. So just being able to recognise how that happens is a useful thing. So I then just found that very useful to take that into the bigger picture view of, okay, how am I going to affect change locally? And I used the food system intentionally because of my experience, but I felt it was possible to have a positive story around that, and not being Pollyanna, but being aware of opportunities. So coming into working on things like food policy, the broad community involvements are really important, and you can get really inspired with overseas activities. I've travelled to Canada and the US and Italy and got inspired with amazing things that were happening with urban agriculture and the transition of food banks into community food centres in Canada, and the way that can actually really address the underlying causes of food insecurity, which is often rooted in poverty and precarious employment and things like that. And then at the time back then, Bendigo had been doing a lot of work on food security, and there was research being done. The council had this Healthy Together Bendigo, and then there was the building of the coalition that became the Bendigo Regional Food Alliance that came out of a lot of that work from council, and I got involved with that. And was also very involved consulting for the creation of or feasibilities of community food hubs as a way to improve people's access to healthy and nutritious food, but also to stimulate local food economies. So did consulting in local governments, Bendigo and Wangaratta and Werribee, and really ended up recognising that was actually, there is a role for local government in stimulating and leading some of that and bringing players together. So that was some of the food policy stuff that I started getting involved with. And then with the climate focus, similarly, I made it a point of every time I speak somewhere, I'd be drawing that link between climate and health, and have been doing that a lot. And it's, again, one of those areas where it's really important to have a positive narrative, because I think it can be quite defeatist to be all gloom and doom. I mean, some of that, the information that we hear is actually quite overwhelming. And I think that to know that we're looking at reframing actions into a community focus for like a public or common good can be quite empowering, I suppose is a word. But if you see, I suppose there was an example of providing a bit of a vision to inspire people. That film 2040, that when it came out, that was really good. Just so people, not everybody can actually project and be a big picture person. So those sorts of things are really very inspiring.
And what are some of the, I guess, the takeaways in terms of like some of the things that really help the success of the Food Hub project coming together in the end?
Well, it's more the having a policy for a food system strategy for the Bendigo. And when I started on council, I thought we'll have more community gardens and we'll do this and we'll get that happening next year. And then I realised, I started to understand what it takes in that particular setting, that some processes seem to be fairly slow, but it can be also that you need to bring people along with you. So establishing great working relationships with people, being able to tell the story of the importance of this work, and then understanding what are the processes that you might need to understand to create, say, a policy outcome. So you can't get a policy outcome if you don't have staff to do the work to develop the policy, and you can't get the staff unless you have a budget that will actually support the employment of the staff. So you've got to start way back to advocate to get people supporting the idea that we need to actually have a budget to employ someone who might work in food systems. And then they might do some consultation, and then it becomes a priority area. There's a policy that's developed, and then there's some roles and actions that go with. In the case of Bendigo, the food system strategy is a 10-year strategy launched last year after 4 years of work to get it there. But it's been much more in the making, but just in the more recent council experience I had. And then once you've got a policy, you've actually got actions. You've got 30 partners or more in Bendigo in different aspects of what can happen. It might be decreasing food waste, increasing access to healthy food, supporting our growers, supporting learning skills around cooking and sharing food, all those sorts of things. But unless you have then some budget to implement some of that stuff, nothing's going to happen. So that's the next step. You've got to actually make sure that it gets its own support for implementation. So learning all that has been actually really good learning. It doesn't take away from what the community can do, but the community is involved at all points in that. And now working with the community, there's a sort of an overall ambition, and the community's got lots of ways of being part of that. So that's really exciting. So, and then when it comes to the climate stuff, well, another learning I had was I actually thought, well, I looked at what was happening in England, and I think it was at the time of Jeremy Corbyn, and I noticed how much he talked about environmental and climate breakdown, the language. And so I thought the language was really important. And again, about that, the issue of bringing people along with you who may or may not have felt comfortable going all out, all bells and whistles, declaring a climate emergency. So I, over a couple of years, worked on the notion of us declaring or acknowledging the urgency for the need for action for council to act on climate and biodiversity breakdown. And with that, a whole lot of stipulations, and this went as a notice of motion, which is a thing you can do as a councillor if you have support around the table. And so recommendations that, the council looks at its approach to climate risk, has a look at the impact that climate change is going to have on infrastructure and the costs to the business over years, the types of things that we can be doing to improve our biodiversity, and that can start with not only protecting and enhancing, but you've got to have some policy there for that to happen. Getting a really good and clear idea of where the emissions are and what's contributing to, say, council's emissions, but then equally how that sits in respect to the bigger community emissions. So that all led to some action, and now out of that there is work underway. There's climate coordination happening within the council. There's work on a climate action plan, a zero carbon plan, a biodiversity policy, and so resilient cities. All those things come under that a broader approach within the organisation. When we look at, if council's done an economic development strategy, for example, in the past, it'd all be about business and, turnover and getting big players in to have great business ideas. But climate change is one of the big priorities of the economic development strategy for council, and that's working across big organisations and lots of groups in the community. Over the last 18 months, there's been, several workshops and lots of groups involved to bring together organisations to create an alliance. And that's something you're going to hear a lot about this year. So we want to bring people along. We want to bring the businesses, the organisations, but then also the community on a grand scale to work together to make these sorts of shifts.
No, brilliant. No, thanks for that. And a lot of exciting things coming up for this year as well that you've already talked about. So what about, so given that 2020 was a bit of a wake-up call for us all in relation to more the community resilience and local-led solutions, what do you think we could all take away from the learnings from what's happened last year and going forward about, thinking about how we're going to do things differently, or even putting into action right now in relation to that big change during the year?
Yeah, it's interesting. Hasn't it been a pause to reflect? And there's been some really interesting perspectives, people reappraising priorities. And so I just had thought, if we've got, we have shown worldwide the most amazing collective responses as communities to tackle that challenge of COVID. I mean, it's still ongoing, and in some areas it's, it's fluctuating, but who would have thought a year ago, when we were still in the bushfire sort of focus, that we would be so accustomed to routine mask wearing and border closures and no travel internationally and all these things. It was just an amazing shift in society. If we can all pull together and make those sorts of changes for the common good, which is what it was, imagine what we can do for other challenges. So I think that's a really good inspiration to me, and it does make me very optimistic that with the right supports, we can do all sorts of things to tackle challenges. Some of the things that came out of COVID also, as the Australian Food Network, they did a great survey they've called it the Pandemic Gardening Survey, and they got over 9,000 responses. 20% of people who responded said they wouldn't have got through COVID without some sort of outlet like gardening. So if you went to a nursery earlier last year, you could not buy seeds, you could barely buy seedlings. People were just passionate about growing some food. They might have had a bad experience of, when people were getting a bit frantic in supermarkets, but started to realise that those extended supply networks, they actually make us really vulnerable. And that if we localise things, that will help us be more resilient into the future. And also, I suppose it's always a great idea to support what's happening locally with ideas. And one that people have heard about, obviously, is Beehive. And I think, if people are keen to keep that focus at the local, what better way of doing it than actually having an online platform that allows you to identify a local village of people with like a community of interest, sharing things and sharing information, and then communities of interest where there's specific interest groups that you can also connect up with. So that villages and the communities on Beehive are a wonderful tool that we are so lucky in Bendigo.
Mm.
Ian McBurney and the crew who've been to put all that time and energy to get us a working example of how we can actually strengthen our local actions.
Yeah, so for those that haven't heard of Beehive, if you're listening into this, tune in on the Make a Change news page. There's an interview with Ian McBurney about this Beehive local sharing economy platform, definitely worth checking in. So what's your vision for the future, and what sort of, broadly would you love to see happen?
We've got this interesting merging of a lot of movements of community and environment and social justice, and it's an interesting time that people are realising the interconnectedness of all of that. So that's part of that vision of being inclusive and inclusive, well and happy is another one. But I suppose another thing that's going to happen this year, just talking about processes of things, I mean, obviously, through council work, we're looking at trying to build the renewables to help with the COVID recovery and attract people there to that type of industry, because there's jobs. Certainly want to see the community food hub that's being planned progress this year. A big waste solution for Bendigo, that's in the pipeline. So we're looking at, ways of scaling all of that up into becoming more of a centre for resource recovery. And of course, I mentioned the climate work, but there's one thing that's happening with council this year, and because it's a new council and because we have a new local government act, this is sort of the boring bit, we're actually now legally mandated to have a 10-year vision as a council, and that then means you have your 4-year council plan and you have your health and wellbeing plan and other plans. But that 10-year vision means we need to engage a lot with the community. So people are going to hear very soon, in the next couple of weeks, about a process called Imagine Greater Bendigo. And it's going to be a really big consultation process, and that's just starting. So look out for that. So there's going to be a lot of opportunities to get involved, is what I'm getting at. So it's not going to just be, a group of councillors or staff sitting around a table saying, we think this is good for the next 30 years. We're going to be going out to the community and really trying hard for people to have a voice and have a say. So all those things that are welling up that people think are important, if they're starting to put their mind to the future, please come forward and be part of it, because it's the ideas that are going to form what happens.
So a lot of our listeners and people who get involved in Make a Change are working on projects and ideas to make a difference. Given all the years and the different things you've been involved in, what's one piece of advice you can give others looking to make a change?
Well, it's good to get outside of your bubble too. That's partly why it's good when groups mix with other groups. So you do hear different opinions and approaches to things. But I've always liked, there's actually two things, so I'll cheat. One is, if you're not on the map, make your own map. And something that sort of goes with that is it never hurts to ask, as people can only say no.
Yeah, fantastic. No, that's really good advice. And yeah, you've been connected and participated in many of our programs and events to support community. And in fact, we've got a Let's Pivot, the program that's supported by the City of Greater Bendigo as well as other organisations. And we've got our next Zoom discussion series coming up. What are your thoughts on this and why people should get involved in something like that?
Yeah, I'm a great believer in letting 1,000 flowers bloom, because there's sometimes we wait for the big idea and think, oh, someone will have a big idea, and sometimes they do. But look at all the great ideas that come from just a small spark of something. And it doesn't have to be groundbreaking. It can be a modest idea, but it can have an impact, and then it can inspire someone else, and then you get that ripple effect. And so before you know it, you've got a whole lot of people saying, yeah, we should do something about that, or I'd like to be part of this, and well, that's a great idea, why don't you do that? So I think it just generates an energy and a momentum, and you really do find that it can be transformative, depending, who you connect up with. And that's the whole power of having the organisations like yours to facilitate that and to support people. And it's great seeing people emerge from that process that have developed all sorts of ideas and gone on to do some things, or maybe just been happy that they've had those ideas, but it's very affirming too. So there's a whole range of outcomes that you can have. You don't have to be the champion of everything, but you can be part of something.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, I've seen that actually happen out of this work is people have come up with different things, and some just had a little idea that was sitting in the background. They're already working on community stuff, and they had this little idea, but just the fact that they got to mention the idea, it came to life. They put it out there. They had people, it was actually a little, to create like a sensory garden in Eaglehawk. Actually, this is just one example.
Beautiful.
Yeah, and they've been wanting to do it for ages, and then they joined this group and they got to develop the idea and chat to people, and they put it out there, and the local paper did a little story on it because they wanted to know what projects people were working on. It went on the front page of the local paper, and then all these people in the neighbourhood said, yeah, I want to be involved in that. And it took a life on its own. So yeah, that's definitely the possibilities. But it doesn't have to be like, you know, a groundbreaking big picture thing, just something little, and just that impetus to keep going, or that motivation or connection or new thoughts on how to approach it makes a difference.
Yeah, certainly.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for that.